My wife sold my daughter's childhood teddy bear, the one she's had since birth, for her boyfriend's gift. When my daughter noticed it was gone, she didn't cry. She just stopped talking. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Darren Cole's mornings started before the sun came up. Not because some motivational idea had taken hold of him. Not because he had ever decided, at some defining moment, that this was the kind of man he wanted to be. He got up early because the work required it, and the work was all he had. The logistics warehouse on the east side of Akron opened at 5:30, and Darren was always there by 5:15. Early enough to check the overnight inventory reports. Early enough to pour a cup of terrible breakroom coffee and stand in the loading dock doorway while the sky turned from black to gray. The suburb they lived in was the kind of place that had been decent once. A few of the original residents still kept their yards clean, still painted their shutters on time, still waved when you drove past. Most did not. Darren and Kelsey had bought the house 6 years ago, when Mia was a newborn and the neighborhood still held something of its old character. Back then, the purchase had felt like momentum, like they were building something. The mortgage was tight, but workable. The house needed attention, but had good bones. Darren had stood at the rusted fence out back the first spring and told himself he would have it painted by summer. He never painted it. There was always something else, a car repair, a utility bill that came in higher than expected, a medical cost that arrived without warning and sat on the kitchen table like an accusation. The fence stayed the same rusted brown it had always been, and somewhere in the years between that first spring and now, Darren had stopped looking at it. You learned to stop seeing things when fixing them was not an option. You learned to narrow your focus to what you could actually affect. That was something the warehouse had taught him, and he had carried it home. Evenings were different. Evenings were Mia. She was 5 years old, slight for her age, with serious brown eyes that took in more than she ever put into words. She had her father's patience, that quiet steadiness that other parents sometimes mistook for shyness when they saw her standing apart at birthday parties, watching the games before she chose to join them. Darren would come home from the warehouse smelling like concrete dust and machine oil, and she would be in the hallway. Not jumping, not calling out. Just there, as if she had calculated the exact minute he would arrive and positioned herself accordingly. They had their routines. Dinner first, whatever Darren could manage after a long shift. Pasta with Jared sauce on most nights. Soup when the weather turned cold. Scrambled eggs and toast when energy ran low and neither of them complained about it. Then the floor. They would sit together on the living room rug while Kelsey watched television in the back room, and Mia would arrange her toys and constructions that followed a logic only she fully understood. Darren would watch and ask questions. She would explain with the serious patience of someone delivering a careful briefing. Those 30 minutes each evening were the best part of his day. He had known that for a while, and lately he had stopped feeling guilty about admitting it. At the center of every arrangement, without exception, was the teddy bear. It was old. It had been old the night Darren bought it, pulled from a discount bin at a 24-hour drugstore at 2 in the morning while Kelsey was still in labor. He had left to get her phone charger, realized in the car that they had never actually bought anything for the baby, hadn't agreed on a name, hadn't settled on a color for the room, and grabbed what was available in a bin marked clearance near the front register. The bear was the cheapest thing in it. Faded tan fur, stuffed unevenly so one side sat fuller than the other. One ear stitched back on with thread, a shade darker than the fabric. Visible if you looked closely, which Mia always did. Darren had bought it feeling slightly ashamed. He had tucked it into her blanket that first night, half expecting Kelsey to replace it with something better within the week. She never did. Mia named it Button. She slept with it every night, carried it through the house during the day, held it against her stomach when she was sick, propped it up to watch whatever she was doing when she was happy. Button was not a toy. Button was a fixture, as necessary to the morning as the light through the kitchen window, as reliable as the particular creak of the second step on the stairs. The night the bear disappeared, Darren came home to a house that felt wrong before he had fully formed a reason why. It was a physical sense, the way a room feels when something has been removed from it, when the layout is the same, but the weight is different. He set his bag down in the entryway, noticed the particular quality of the quiet, and found Mia in the living room with her arms held slightly in front of her body. Not reaching, just held. The way you hold your arms when they're used to carrying something, and the weight is gone, and the body has not caught up to the absence yet. "Where's Button?" Darren asked. "I don't know," Mia said. She said it the way adults say it when they do know, but the knowing is too large to carry out loud. Darren checked the usual places. Under the couch, behind the cushions, the bedroom floor, the basket of stuffed animals in the corner of her room. Nothing. He found Kelsey in the bathroom at the mirror, drawing a thin, careful line along her eye with practiced ease. She did not look up when he came in. She knew he was there. "Have you seen me as Bear?" "I threw it out," Kelsey said. "Not quickly. Not defensively. The way you mentioned closing a window you had left open. Already past it." Darren stared at her reflection. "You threw it out. She's 5. She doesn't need to be dragging that thing everywhere. It was falling apart. That thing has a name. She's had it since the hospital." Kelsey finished the line on her eye, set the pencil down. "It was old and worn. I got rid of it." "Where?" "Outside bin. It's trash day tomorrow." Darren went outside. He checked the trash bin, the recycling, the bags already set at the curb. Nothing. Either it was buried deep under something he couldn't see in the dark, or it was already gone, or it had never been there. He stood at the curb for a moment in the cold night air, hands in his jacket pockets, looking down the quiet street at the orange pools of light under each street lamp. Cars parked in rows, leaves stuck against gutters, a dog somewhere in the middle distance. Something sat wrong with him that went beyond the bear itself. It was the delivery of it, the complete flatness in Kelsey's voice, the way she hadn't paused, hadn't considered how Mia would respond, hadn't offered any version of an apology for the disruption. There was no guilt in her posture, no small hesitation hidden in the corners of her explanation. Just a fact, stated and discarded, the same as the bear itself. Back inside, Mia had gone to bed. She had not cried, which was somehow harder to witness than if she had. She lay on her side with both arms held against her chest in the exact position she kept when Button was there, and her eyes were open in the dark when Darren looked in through the doorway. He came in and sat on the edge of her bed. She said nothing. He said nothing either. He sat until her breathing slowed and the open eyes finally closed. Then he turned off the hall light and left the door slightly ajar the way she preferred it. She stopped talking much after that. Not entirely. She answered questions when asked. She said please and thank you in her careful way and moved through the house and went to school and came home. But the running commentary stopped, the steady, earnest stream of observation that had been background music to every evening for years. What Button was thinking, what she had noticed about the shape of a cloud that afternoon. The small daily gifts of a child who has not yet learned that not everything needs to be said. The house went quieter than Darren had thought possible, and the quiet had weight. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself 5-year-olds adapted. He told himself he would find the bear or buy a replacement and things would level out. He was wrong on every count. 3 nights after the bear disappeared, Kelsey left her tablet on the kitchen counter while she went to shower. Darren was cleaning up after dinner. He had no intention of touching it. The notification appeared on the screen while he was moving between the table and the sink, and he saw it before he could choose not to. The screen lit up with a preview he could read from 2 feet away. He picked up the tablet. He told himself later that he had known, on some level, what he was about to find. That the year of growing distance, the long evenings away from home, the phone always screened down on flat surfaces, the conversations that ended the moment he entered a room, the perfume on Tuesday nights when there was supposedly nowhere to go, had all been pointing at something he had refused to fully name. He was not naive. He had simply been a man who believed that problems could be worked through if both people were willing. And he had kept his face turned toward that possibility long past, when he should have looked at what was actually there. The message on the screen was from a contact saved only as initials. The preview read, "You really gave me that old thing? That's kind of messed up, LOL." A picture had loaded below it. The teddy bear, on a couch he did not recognize, next to a man he had never seen. The man was laughing at the camera. Button sat beside him like an exhibit. The contact's full name, when Darren opened the conversation, was Logan Pierce. He stood in the kitchen and read for 37 minutes. He knew the time because the microwave clock was directly in his line of sight, and he watched the digits advance while he scrolled. He was not a man who lost his composure easily. Years on the warehouse floor in situations that required decisive calm had trained that response out of him, and he did not lose it now. He felt the anger move through him like something heated and slow, not explosive, something that distributed evenly, that reached into every corner. The romantic messages he moved through quickly. They were what they were, the breathless, competitive energy of a new affair, more interested in the game than in any actual feeling. He cataloged them and kept going. What stopped him were the practical ones. Kelsey had done research. He found a thread where she described their assets in careful terms. The equity in the house, the value of his pension contributions, the income disparity between his warehouse supervisor salary and her part-time administrative work. She talked about Ohio custody law with the fluency of someone who had spent time on informational websites. She used the word leverage in 3 separate messages. Logan replied with enthusiasm each time, suggesting attorneys, recommending someone a friend had used, asking about Mia with the curiosity of a person calculating a variable in an equation. And then the line. One line among dozens. But the one he came back to. I don't even want the kid. He can keep her. I just want paid. Darren set the tablet down on the counter. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. The shower was still running down the hall. The refrigerator hummed its low, constant note. Outside, a car passed, its headlights brushing through the window and sweeping once across the wall before the room went dark again. Darren looked at the wall above the counter, at the drawing Mia had brought home 2 weeks ago, taped there because the regular tape had been somewhere he couldn't find and painter's tape was what was available. A house with a green sky because she'd picked up the wrong crayon and hadn't wanted to start over. 3 stick figures out front, each one labeled in the large, careful printing of a child who had just learned how letters worked. He looked at the labels for a long time. Then he kept going. He went through the email app, the notes application, the calendar. He was thorough without frantic speed, moving with the focused attention that kicks in when emotion becomes too large for reaction and converts instead into the need to understand the complete picture. He found an appointment with a family law attorney scheduled for the prior week, already passed. He found a note listing their assets with rough valuations. He found a contact list that included the attorney's name, Logan's name, and 2 others whose roles he could guess at. He put the tablet back exactly where it had been, rotated it to the same angle, walked back to the sink, and finished the dishes. By the time Kelsey came out of the shower, the kitchen was clean. He handed her a glass of water when she passed through. She took it without looking at him, said nothing, went to the bedroom. He heard the television come on. He stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark yard for a long time. This was not a marriage that had drifted. This was not 2 people who had grown apart through ordinary distance and ordinary neglect and found themselves strangers. This was a plan, drafted, scheduled, already moving forward. She had done the research, made the contacts, calculated the approach, and executed the first step, the bear, the message, the casual cruelty of it, while he was at the warehouse at 5 in the morning keeping the household running. And she had not once, in any message he found, mentioned Mia with anything resembling concern. The child appeared in those conversations as a factor, a number in a column, something to be managed and set aside. That was what stayed with him in the dark and quiet of those late hours. Not his own loss, though that was real, and he would feel it fully in time. Mia, 5 years old, and sleeping down the hall with her arms holding nothing. Reduced, in her mother's planning, to a line about not wanting her, a variable to leave behind on the way to something better. He would not let that stand, but he would not be reckless about it either. Darren spent the next day at the warehouse in a state of focused calm that his supervisor probably read as a bad morning. He moved through the inventory floor with his clipboard and his headset and answered questions when they came and did not volunteer anything additional. He was thinking. He thought the way he solved warehouse problems, mapping the situation, identifying the pressure points, considering what was within his control and what was not. He had a set of facts. He had an opponent who was organized, had legal counsel, and had a head start. He had a daughter who needed him to handle this correctly. The margin for emotional decision-making was 0. By his lunch break, he had the name of an attorney. He had taken it 2 years ago from a colleague who had gone through a difficult divorce and come out the other side with his finances and his relationship with his kids intact. Darren had written the name on the back of a receipt without knowing why. He found it still in his wallet, folded small in the card slot behind his bus pass. He called from his car during the break, made an appointment for the following morning. That evening, dinner was pasta and a salad and something approaching normal. Darren set the table the way he always did, called them both to eat. Mia came and sat, arranged button on the chair beside her, ate with the careful attention she brought to most tasks. Kelsey came and dressed for somewhere she hadn't mentioned, sat down, picked at the salad. Darren ate and watched and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Work good." "Fine," Kelsey said. She did not look up. "Busy week?" "Not really." He let a moment pass, took another bite, set down his fork with the deliberateness of someone making a considered choice. "I've been thinking," he said, "maybe we should talk to a lawyer, just to get a clear picture of where we stand financially. House equity, contributions, all of it. Just to know." The fork in Kelsey's hand stopped moving. It was a fraction of a second. She recovered it smoothly, brought the fork up, chewed, kept her expression somewhere between mild interest and mild indifference. But the pause had been real. Darren had composed a sentence specifically to produce that pause. He had needed to see whether what came back was surprise or calculation. What came back was calculation. She smiled after. A light, easy smile. Why would we need that? We're fine. Just planning ahead, Darren said. Good to have things documented. Saves confusion down the road. We don't need to pay an attorney to tell us what's in our savings account. Probably not, Darren agreed pleasantly. She looked at him then, a direct look, the first genuine eye contact she had offered in days. He held it without any particular expression. She seemed to find nothing useful in his face, which was exactly what he intended. After a moment, she looked back at her plate and ate the rest of her dinner with a careful, measured tempo of someone making sure they were not eating too fast or too slow. Mia watched her father across the table the whole time. She said nothing. She was saying nothing in general those days. But her eyes were on him with the attentive seriousness she used when she was deciding whether something could be trusted, and something in her father's steadiness seemed to register as an answer. After dinner, Kelsey gathered her bag and keys and said she was meeting a friend. Darren cleared the table. He heard the front door, heard her car back down the driveway. He turned off the faucet, dried his hands, and sat down at the kitchen table with a receipt from his wallet. He called the attorney's number, left a message with his name and his availability. Then he went to the living room, sat on the floor, and waited. Mia came down from her room after a few minutes. She did not say anything. She sat beside him and arranged some blocks into a careful structure while Button watched from the couch armrest. Darren watched her build. He did not tell her things were going to be fine. He did not know that yet with the certainty that statement would require. What he knew was that he was going to do every precise, measured, careful thing available to him to make it true. That was a different kind of promise, one that depended on him and not on hope. And he held it quietly in the particular way of a man who intends to keep it. Darren did not go to the bar looking for a fight. He told himself that on the drive over. He told himself he was going to retrieve something that had been taken, that he had a clear and reasonable purpose, that a measured man with a clear purpose did not walk into situations without knowing what he intended to come out with. He kept both hands on the wheel and kept his speed below the limit. He had found Logan Pierce without much effort. The man's social media presence was public and generous with detail. Employer, neighborhood, regular venues, a bar on the outer edge of town where he appeared in pictures often enough that it qualified as a regular spot. Darren had spent 10 minutes looking and found what he needed. Careful people did not post photographs of other men's daughters' belongings to accounts that anyone could see. The bar was trying to be a dive and mostly succeeding. Neon signs in the windows that weren't quite bright enough to read from across the parking lot. 4 cars outside on a Wednesday night. Inside, the music was louder than the crowd required. A handful of people at the bar, 2 booths along the far wall, a bartender moving glasses between the same 3 spots. The air was warm and smelled of something fried and something spilled and the specific closeness of a room that absorbed the same evening over and over. Darren stood in the doorway for a moment until his eyes adjusted. Then he went to the bar. Logan was 2 stools down. In person, he was about what the photographs had suggested. Younger than 30, dressed in the deliberate, casual way of someone who had decided that looking effortless was itself a form of effort. He was talking to a woman at the bar with the half-turned, slightly too loud manner of someone performing a conversation rather than having one. He hadn't noticed Darren come in. Darren ordered something he didn't intend to drink. He waited. It took Logan 11 minutes. Not because Darren was being subtle, but because Logan was not particularly observant. When the recognition came, it came slowly. A glance, a second glance, a longer look. Then the man's posture shifted by a small degree. The loose ease tightened somewhere beneath the surface. Darren turned on his stool to face him directly. You have something that belongs to my daughter. His voice was the voice he used at work when a supplier had shorted a load and there was no real dispute to be had, just a correction to be made. Not aggressive, not emotional, transactional. Logan blinked. Then he found the version of himself that worked in situations he'd decided to control. The loose half-smile, the slight lean back, the attempt to own the more space. Your wife gave me that. That's not my problem. It's your problem now, Darren said. The woman 2 stools down had gone quiet. The bartender found something to do at the far end of the bar. Logan stood up. He was a few inches taller and used it the way men who have a few inches on someone tend to, squaring up, letting the height speak before anything else did. I don't know what you think you're doing here. Darren had not planned the next part. But he had also spent 2 weeks being a measured, methodical person while another man sat on a couch with his daughter's bear and laughed at a camera and at some point the gap between restraint and action closes on its own. It was fast and not heroic. A shove from Logan's hand against Darren's shoulder, the testing kind, meant to establish something, and then Darren moved. Not cleanly. A grab, a pull, the scrape of a stool across the floor. A glass going somewhere with a short, sharp sound. Two men from the far booth were up, and between them in seconds, the reflexive peacekeeping of men in bars who understand that nobody wins in a Tuesday night situation. Hands on shoulders. Firm, impersonal. All right. 30 seconds. Maybe less. Outside in the parking lot, under a yellow light with gravel underfoot, they stood apart. Logan had a reddened patch along his jawline. His hair was slightly out of arrangement. The performance was entirely gone now. What was underneath, it was smaller and more uncertain. The way people look when their assumptions about a situation have failed them. Look, Logan started. He held up one hand in a gesture that was half surrender, half negotiation. The bear, Darren said. Logan stared at him. Then something in his expression shifted. The involuntary, genuine kind of shift that comes before a person decides to stop wasting time. You came all the way out here for a stuffed animal. I came out here for my daughter's stuffed animal, Darren said. Tonight. The silence between them was the kind that is weight. Logan looked at him for a moment with something that might have been, under different circumstances, a form of reluctant respect. Give me 20 minutes, he said. He went to his car. Darren waited in the parking lot and looked at the orange glow above the roofline of the bar and breathed in cold air. 23 minutes later, Logan pulled back in and got out with a plastic bag. He held it out without ceremony. Darren took the bear from the bag. He turned it over in his hands. The familiar weight of it, the uneven stuffing, the ear with its darker stitching. All there. He looked at it for a moment, then at Logan. There was nothing to say that would land the way he wanted it to. He turned and got into his car. On the passenger seat on the way home, he laid the bear carefully. He reached over and pulled the seat belt across it, which he knew was not a rational action, and did anyway. The belt clicked into place. He drove. It was not a victory. A victory would have been the bear never leaving the house. But in the space between what you can prevent and what you can recover, sometimes the only available win is the return. Mia was awake when Darren got home. She was on the couch in her pajamas, the particular stillness of a child who has decided to wait for something without knowing if it will come. A glass of water on the side table. The television off. Kelsey's car was not in the driveway. The house had the specific quality of a space that contains one person who is doing their best to hold very still. Darren came through the front door with button held out in both hands, the way you carry something that belongs to someone else. Mia went completely still. She looked at the bear with the expression of a person who has wanted something so long that the arrival of it seems briefly impossible. Her hand stayed in her lap. She did not reach. Like the wanting was so deep by now that the body had grown cautious. Darren crossed the room and placed it in her lap. Her hands came up slowly. Fingers found the stitched ear first. They always did. It was the first thing she touched every morning, a kind of greeting between them. She ran her thumb along the darker thread. Then the uneven side, the fuller stuffing, familiar as a handshake. She brought the bear up and pressed it against her face, and her shoulders curved around it the way they had for 5 years, the automatic closing motion of a child coming back to the thing they know best. You got him back? She whispered. Yes, Darren said. She held on to that for a moment. Her eyes were dry. Her expression was the careful, contained seriousness that had become her face in the days Button was gone. The look of a child who has decided not to need things because needing them had gotten her nowhere. And then she cried. Not loudly. Not in the way of frustration or anger or the sudden shock of a small pain. This was something else entirely. The crying of a thing held too tightly for too long, suddenly released. Quiet and continuous and deep. Her small shoulders shaking in a rhythm she had no control over. She held Button tighter as she cried, not looser, as if the bear might still be taken if she relaxed her grip even slightly. Darren sat beside her on the couch. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and he felt the shaking move from her body into his. He did not say anything. There were things he could have said, reassurances, explanations, the soft language adults use when children are hurting. He stayed quiet instead. He had learned that there are moments when words arrive as noise. He said, eventually, 2 words. I've got you. She cried for a while after that. Then the shaking slowed. Then it stopped the way storms stop. Not all at once, but tapering, the last of it going out in small, quiet intervals. She stayed against him with the bear between them. He looked at the wall. He had thought, in the kitchen 3 nights ago with a tablet in his hands, that what had been taken from him was his marriage, his future, his assumption that the structure he'd spent years building was real and shared and aimed at something. Those were true losses. He had thought about them at length in the early hours of mornings when the warehouse wasn't open yet and the house was dark. But sitting on this couch, with his daughter's tears cooling against his shirt, he understood something more precisely than he had before. What had been taken from Mia was not a toy. What had been taken from her was the sense that the walls around her were solid, that the people responsible for her safety could be trusted with the ordinary items of her world. Children at 5 years old did not have the vocabulary for betrayal or disruption. What they had was physical reality, the weight of a familiar thing in their arms, the presence of it each morning, the reliability of it each night. And then, without warning and without explanation that a 5-year-old could translate into sense, that thing was gone. Not misplaced. Removed on purpose by someone who was supposed to be one of the walls. Kelsey had not thrown out a worn toy. She had sent a message in a language Mia was too young to name, but not too young to receive. That comfort could be taken. That safety was provisional. That the people who were supposed to protect you might not be thinking about you at all. That was the calculation Darren had seen at the dinner table. Not cruelty for its own sake, something colder. An indifference so complete that a child's grief had simply not registered as a factor in the planning. He held his daughter until she slept, the shaking long gone, button pressed between them. Then he moved her carefully to her bed, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and placed the bear beside her in the exact position she kept it, on her left, slightly angled toward her, the way it always was. He stood in the doorway for a long time. He was not a man who used words like ruthless to describe himself. He was a man who showed up early, kept records, solved problems with method rather than volume, and did not quit when things got hard. But standing in that doorway looking at his sleeping daughter, he felt something settle into place inside him with the finality of something locked. Whatever this required, every document, every appointment, every careful and methodical step, he would do all of it. He would not be moved from it. He would not be softened or negotiated away from it. Not for anything. In the weeks that followed, Darren became very organized. This was not a dramatic change. He had always been organized. The warehouse required it. The mortgage required it. Single parenting and all but name required it. But he redirected the precision that kept his professional life running and applied it with full attention to something new. He bought a cheap spiral notebook from the drugstore and kept it in his locked glove box. He did not bring it into the house. He recorded dates and times. Kelsey's patterns of coming and going, noted without commentary. Mia's behavior, documented with the clinical care of a man building a record, not the bitterness of a man nursing a grievance. A note from Mia's kindergarten teacher expressing concern about withdrawal. A school behavior report from the week after the bear went missing. He photocopied both at the library. Ohio allowed one-party consent recording. He had confirmed this with his attorney at their first appointment. A quiet, precise woman who wore reading glasses on the end of her nose and had the particular manner of someone who had sat across from a great many people in difficult situations and learned to hear what they left unsaid. She had looked at what Darren brought to that first meeting and said, "This is thorough." The respect in her voice was professional and real. Darren began keeping his phone in his shirt pocket during evenings at home. Most of what he captured was ordinary to the point of being unremarkable. The tight, clipped exchanges at the dinner table, the sound of a door closing, the absence of conversation that had become its own kind of atmosphere. Some evenings Kelsey did not come home. He noted those too, with times and dates, no adjectives. Over 3 more appointments. His attorney assembled the financial picture. She pulled records, obtained documentation through proper legal channels, prepared filings. She had looked at the messages, reviewed in their entirety, not excerpted, not stripped of context, and told Darren that the statement about not wanting Mia was, in the language of family court, significant. She said plainly, Darren said. People often do, his attorney said, when they believe they're speaking privately. She made a note. We'll use it. He kept his life otherwise unchanged. He went to work. He came home. He made dinner. He sat on the floor with Mia, who was slowly finding her way back. Not to exactly where she had been, because that child had been changed by what happened, but somewhere quieter and more careful and still fundamentally her. She laughed once during their floor time at something he said, a real laugh, full and startled, and Darren stored that in the same place he kept the important things. Kelsey moved through the house like someone who had already partially left in every way that mattered. Long evenings away, no explanations offered or requested. Phone in the bedroom with the door closed. A kind of aggressive absence that was almost a presence in itself. Once he heard her laughing behind the closed door, a real, unguarded laugh, the kind she hadn't aimed at him in longer than he could accurately calculate. It did not hit him the way it once would have. He had rearranged himself around a different goal, and the old architecture of what had hurt him was already coming down. One evening in late autumn, Kelsey came to the kitchen while he was washing the dinner dishes. She stood in the doorway the way she did when she was deciding something, then came and sat at the table. He kept washing. He heard her exhale, a careful, measured breath, the breath of a person about to say something prepared. "I think we should separate," she said. The same voice she'd used to say the bear had been thrown out. Casual, already past it before the words fully landed. Darren turned off the faucet. He dried his hands slowly. He turned around. "Okay," he said. She blinked. The same rapid recalibration he had seen weeks ago at the dinner table. The flicker of a person adjusting when the landscape is not what they expected. She had prepared for something. Resistance. Anger. An emotional response she could shape her plan around. She had gotten agreement, and agreement from the wrong person in the wrong tone could mean many things. "That's it," she said. "No back and forth. We handle it clean." He held her gaze. Mature. She smiled. Slow and satisfied. The smile of a person who believes they have already won and are now simply watching the final formality complete itself. She was warm in a way she hadn't been in months, not toward him, not genuinely, but in the way people become when they no longer need to be guarded. "I think that's the right approach," she said. She talked about attorneys, about keeping things simple, about a process that could be efficient and dignified. She spoke like someone who had already mentally moved the furniture and was describing the new arrangement. She did not mention Mia. Not once. Not in passing. Darren noted that. "I'll have my attorney reach out to yours," he said. A pause. The pause of a person encountering an unexpected object in a familiar room. "Your attorney. I've had one for a few weeks," Darren said. "I believe in being prepared." Something moved behind her eyes. Not quite alarm. More like the involuntary acknowledgement of a person who has realized a room is not the size they thought it was. She covered it. Said she was going out. He heard her in the bedroom for a few minutes. Then her keys, then the door. What she did not know, what she had no way to know, was that 2 days prior, his attorney had filed. The filing included the documented messages, the full thread secured through legal process, the timeline of the affair mapped against the financial planning conversations, the school documentation and behavioral records, the recorded conversations captured with one-party consent. It included a formal statement requesting sole legal custody of Mia, with supervised visitation contingent on evaluation, citing the respondent's own written words about having no interest in the child. He had not been waiting. He had already moved, and the ground she thought she was standing on was 3 weeks behind her. The morning of the first custody hearing, Darren was up at 4. He had slept in fragments, not from fear, but from a specific restlessness of a man who has done everything within his power and must now wait on a process that operates on its own schedule. He showered. He pressed his slacks carefully at the kitchen table with the iron he almost never used. He made coffee and drank it standing at the counter in the pre-dawn dark, and he looked at Mia's drawing on the wall. The green sky, the 3 figures, the careful printed labels, and he let himself feel the full weight of the day that was beginning. He dropped Mia at the neighbor's house 2 doors down at 7. The neighbor was a woman in her 60s who had been fond of Mia since before Mia could reliably walk, who handed his daughter a bowl of cereal and put on cartoons and asked Darren no questions except whether he wanted coffee to go. He said no, thanked her, and left. He drove to the courthouse in the gray early morning light and sat in the car for 5 minutes in the parking garage before going in, not hesitating, just letting himself be still for a moment before stillness was no longer available. His attorney was in the hallway outside the assigned courtroom, briefcase open on a bench, reviewing something in a folder with the focused calm of a person who had done this many times and understood that composure was itself a form of preparation. She looked up when he approached. She gave him a single nod. Nothing more was necessary. The courthouse had the quality of institutions built for difficult things, clean but not warm, organized but not comforting. Old tile that had been refinished without losing any of its institutional blankness. Fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly like they were being processed. A security line that moved with the patience of bureaucracy applied to human grief. Kelsey arrived 9 minutes before the session was called. She was dressed with precision. A dark blazer, understated earrings, hair pulled back in the composed way that reads as controlled rather than decorated. She had put thought into this. There was a deliberateness to the image that Darren recognized. She was accompanied by her attorney, a younger man with the easy bearing of someone who had trained himself to seem relaxed in rooms where relaxed was a strategic choice. She sat at the opposing table without looking at Darren. She arranged herself with the particular stillness of someone who has rehearsed calmness. She whispered to her attorney. He nodded. She looked forward. The judge was a woman in her early 50s with a direct gaze and the manner of someone who had heard a great number of explanations for human behavior and had developed an accurate ear for the difference between what was true and what was constructed to sound true. She reviewed the case documents briefly. Then she looked up. Kelsey's side presented first. Her attorney was skilled. He built the narrative with care. A marriage grown difficult through neglect and emotional absence. A woman who had found herself without partnership or support. A client seeking a fair dissolution of an arrangement that had long since stopped functioning. He used words like estrangement and isolation. He referenced the income disparity. He framed Kelsey's planning as the action of a woman who had simply been more prepared than her spouse. When Kelsey spoke, her voice was steady. She described feeling unseen. She described the emotional distance of a household where communication had broken down. She used the word neglected twice, and both times she delivered it with the quiet weight of someone who had lived inside it rather than chosen it. She looked at the judge with the direct, unguarded expression of a person asking to be believed. She mentioned her daughter once. She spoke about wanting stability from Mia. Her voice softened on the word. It was a practice softening. Darren kept his face neutral. Beside him, he heard his attorney uncap her pen. Then their turn came. His attorney stood and began quietly. She thanked the court. She said she understood the preceding account and appreciated its presentation. She said she would like to offer a different record of the same period. She placed a photograph on the display first. The image from Logan Pierce's social media account. The bear on an unfamiliar couch, the man beside it, the date stamp in the upper corner. She cross-referenced the date against the date Kelsey had told her husband the bear had been discarded. She identified the man in the photograph by name and relationship to the respondent. Then she moved to the messages. They had been secured through proper legal channels. The process documented carefully to ensure admissibility each step of the acquisition on record. They appeared on the screen at the front of the courtroom. Kelsey's attorney objected twice. The judge overruled both objections with brief, decisive language. The messages were read aloud. Not dramatically, methodically, the way evidence is read, one piece at a time, giving each item enough space to be understood before moving to the next. The strategy discussions, the financial analysis of their marital assets, the references to leverage, the coordination with Logan Pierce about attorneys and timelines, the framing of the divorce as a financial operation rather than a personal decision, and the line. When it was read aloud, it had the same quality it had carried the night Darren first saw it on the kitchen counter. Simple, clear, impossible to interpret as anything other than what it was. A statement of intent about a 5-year-old child, written by her mother, in the middle of a plan designed to extract maximum value from the dissolution of a family. The courtroom went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something real has entered them. Kelsey's composure had been cracking since the third exhibit. Not visibly to someone who was not watching for it, but Darren was watching for it. He had studied this face across a dinner table for 6 years. He saw the fine tension developing along her jaw, the slight slowing of her breathing before she corrected it. The moment her eyes stopped tracking the screen and fixed instead on the wood grain of the table in front of her. Those messages have been taken out of context, she said when her attorney gave her the opening. Her voice was still practiced, still aimed at composure. But something underneath it had shifted like a structure that has been stressed from below. My client acknowledges the communications, her attorney added quickly. But the court should consider that private exchanges between individuals often reflect emotion rather than I've reviewed the full thread, counselor. The judge's voice cut through without sharpness. It was simply a fact delivered by someone who dealt in facts. All of it. The context does not improve the picture. The attorney sat down. The judge spoke for 11 minutes. Darren counted. He counted because it gave his attention somewhere precise to go while the words landed around him. Because otherwise, with 8 months of effort arriving at a result in a fluorescent lit room on a cold morning, he thought he might not keep his face exactly where he needed it to be. She addressed the documentary record first. She spoke about the quality of the petitioner's preparation, its scope, its organization, the consistency of the timeline it established. She noted that this level of documentation did not arise from a single evening of response. It represented sustained, structured effort over an extended period, which itself told the court something about the character of the person who had assembled it. She addressed the school records, Mia's teacher's note, the behavioral evaluation, the documented shift in a 5-year-old's engagement and speech following a specific event at home. She addressed this with the same factual directness she had brought to everything else, without inflection, without editorializing. She simply noted what the documents said and what they corresponded to. Then she returned to the message. She read it into the record again. She did not need to. It was already there. But she read it again with the particular deliberateness of a person making something permanent. Then she looked up and looked at Kelsey's side of the room. This statement, reviewed in the full context of the documented exchange and corroborated by the respondent's consistent focus throughout that exchange on financial outcomes rather than parental ones, is not ambiguous, the judge said. The court is not in the business of assigning intent based on tone. The court reads what is written. This is written plainly. Kelsey sat rigid at the table. She had stopped looking at anyone. The court's responsibility is the well-being of the child, the judge continued. That determination is not made by comparing the polish of presentations in this room. It is made by examining what the record shows about each party's demonstrated priorities. She paused. You are planning to abandon your parental responsibility while seeking financial benefit. The sentence fell into the silence and did not move. That is not, Kelsey started. Her attorney's hand came down on her forearm. She stopped. The judge consulted the documents in front of her briefly. I also note that the emotional neglect the respondent has described was not documented, reported, or formally raised prior to these proceedings. The petitioner, by contrast, has produced 8 months of consistent records. The court weighs patterns of behavior, not single moments. The pattern here is clear. Kelsey's attorney made a final attempt. He spoke about good faith and the limitations of text messages as predictors of actual parental behavior. He spoke about his client's genuine desire to maintain a relationship with her daughter. He spoke with skill and received it the same way he had delivered it, without obvious reception. The judge listened. When he finished, she nodded once. Desire is not in question, she said. Demonstration is in question. And the record demonstrates something specific about priorities. She looked at the papers. Support is not a reward for manipulation. She issued the ruling. Primary physical and legal custody of Mia was awarded to Darren. Kelsey received a structured visitation schedule, supervised initially pending a 6-month evaluation. The alimony petition was denied in its entirety. The court found no basis for the financial arrangement the respondent had outlined, given the documented evidence of pre-planned coordination of the separation to maximize financial outcome. The marital asset division followed standard equitable distribution with no supplemental awards. Kelsey sat across the table and did not look at Darren. He did not look at her either. He was looking at the surface of the table in front of him. In the private space that exists between what a person shows and what they actually feel, he let out a breath that he had been holding since the night he stood at the kitchen counter with a tablet in his hands. His attorney put one hand briefly on his forearm, said his name quietly. He nodded. He did not feel triumphant. That surprised him. He had expected something like triumph, some release, some current of feeling that would mark the end of the effort in a way proportionate to its weight. What he felt instead was tired and clear. The particular clarity of a man who has run a long distance, every step deliberate, and arrived at the end and can now, finally, stop calculating. Outside the courthouse in the pale winter sunlight, his attorney walked him through the next steps. He listened carefully. He asked questions. He signed what needed signing. When she shook his hand and told him he had conducted himself with real steadiness over the past months, he thanked her. He called the neighbor's house from the parking lot. Everything okay? The neighbor asked. Everything's fine, Darren said. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He got in the car and drove toward his daughter. The weeks after the hearing settled into a kind of careful quiet. Not the heavy quiet of the weeks after the bear went missing. A different kind, the quiet of something that has been under sustained pressure, finally exhaling. Things found their new shape slowly, the way water finds its level. Darren went back to work. Same 5:15 arrival, same break room coffee, same inventory floor. The warehouse hadn't changed. His co-workers hadn't changed. A supervisor had a new schedule he was still getting used to, and there was a shipment backlog from a supplier delay that needed untangling, and none of this was anything he couldn't handle. The consistency of ordinary problems felt like something he could use. Mia went back to kindergarten with Button in her backpack pocket. Her teacher sent a note home after the second week saying that Mia had been more talkative in class, had volunteered to explain a drawing during sharing time, had laughed with another child during outdoor play, and stayed in the game rather than watching from the side. Darren read the note, standing at the kitchen counter when he got home. He read it 3 times. Then he put it on the wall beside the green sky drawing. The visitation schedule began in the new year. Darren prepared Mia for each visit with the same care he brought to everything else. His own feelings kept entirely out of the conversation. The explanation in simple and honest terms, the consistent presence of Button in her hands before and after. She moved through the visits the way some children move through things they have decided to accept. Not with protest, not with visible enthusiasm, but with a quiet, reserved endurance that was older than her age warranted. He noted that. He noted everything. The court review was in 6 months, and the record continued. He heard about Kelsey the way news travels in places where people know each other by proximity rather than friendship, through a mutual contact at a school pickup, through a remark made to someone who mentioned it to someone else. Logan Pierce had ended things sometime around November. Quickly, without drama, the way that particular kind of person tends to exit when the external conditions that made a situation appealing have changed. The energy of the affair had been the plan itself. The secrecy, the strategy, the sense of being a participant in something that mattered. When the plan collapsed into ordinary consequences, that energy had apparently gone with it. Logan had moved on within weeks. Kelsey had taken an apartment on the far side of town. She was working more hours at work that paid less than the settlement she had planned to access. Darren knew this not because he was tracking her movements, but because information moved through the kind of suburb they lived in whether you asked for it or not. He received it without reaction. It was useful to know where the pieces were, even when they no longer posed any threat. He did not feel satisfaction in any of this. He had expected he would. In the difficult early hours of certain mornings, he had imagined what it would feel like when things balanced out, when the careful work delivered a result, when the plan she had so completely committed to fell apart in the specific ways that plans fall apart when they are built on the assumption that other people will not see what you're doing. He had thought satisfaction would feel like something sharp and earned. The actual experience of it was quieter than the imagined version. It was not the presence of anything new. It was more like the absence of the weight he had been carrying, the lifting of a sustained pressure. Not triumph, more like space. What he felt, with real clarity, was grateful. Grateful for the attorney who had known exactly where to look. Grateful for the $9 spiral notebook locked in his glove box. Grateful for the colleague who had mentioned a lawyer's name 2 years ago in an offhand conversation, because good information had a way of arriving before you understood you would need it. Grateful for every morning he had gotten up at 4:15 and chosen method over reaction. Patience over the kind of decision-making that felt good in the moment and cost you everything in the room that mattered. And grateful, most of all, for the neighbor 2 doors down who had handed his daughter a bowl of cereal and turned on the cartoons and asked no questions while Darren went and stood in front of a judge and built a wall that could not come down. It was a Saturday morning in early December when Darren understood, in the full, physical, settled way that understanding sometimes arrives only long after the intellectual version, that things had genuinely changed. Not just legally, not just structurally, changed in the way that matters most, which is the way a house feels when it has become a home again. The specific quality of the morning light across the kitchen floor. The rhythm of 2 people moving through a shared space without the underlying tension of a structure about to shift. The particular texture of ordinary. He had made pancakes. He was not an ambitious cook, but he made reliable pancakes, slightly thick, butter-cooked, the kind that hold together when a child cuts them with the side of a fork rather than waiting for a knife. Mia sat at the kitchen table with Button propped against the orange juice glass, positioned to watch the cooking process with the serious attention of a dedicated observer. The radio was on at low volume. Something instrumental, the Saturday morning station. Darren stood at the stove and watched the bubbles form on the edges of each pancake and waited for them to be ready to flip. Behind him, Mia was explaining the process to Button. He puts them on the bigger heat first, she said, in the patient instructional voice she used when sharing important information. Because that side set's better. If you flip too early, they go flat in the middle, and that's bad. A small pause, during which Button apparently received this. He told me that. Darren did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the pan and felt something shift quietly in his chest. Not sadness and not joy, but the particular combination of both that arrives when something is clearly, undeniably good, and you are standing in the middle of it, and you know it. He plated the pancakes and brought them to the table. Mia assessed them with the gravity of a professional and declared them acceptable, which, from her, was high praise. He poured more coffee and sat across from her and watched her eat. The morning was mild. Light came through the window at a low winter angle and lay in a band across the table between them. Somewhere outside, 2 houses down, someone was doing something with a leaf blower in December for reasons Darren chose not to examine. A car passed. The radio continued its low, wordless accompaniment to everything. After breakfast, they moved to the floor. It was their routine returning to itself. Not identical to what it had been. Nothing comes back identical. Things that have been through real pressure come back in a shape that is slightly different, reorganized around what was tested. But the shape was good. The toys spread across the rug. Mia's careful constructions, her private logic. Button at the center, as always, the fixed point around which everything else organized. Darren leaned back on his hands and let the morning sit around him. He was not thinking about the warehouse or the court documents or the 6-month review or the woman living in a smaller apartment on the far side of town. He was thinking, if you could call it thinking, about this exact moment. Its weight and texture, the way his daughter's hands moved with complete confidence among her things, the sound of her quiet humming under the radio. He thought, briefly, about what it had cost him to get to this morning. The months of documentation. The early appointments paid for with money, there was not a lot to spare. The specific discipline of a man who knows that reacting too soon loses you the ground you need later. The night he had stood at the kitchen counter with a tablet in his hands and made the decision, in the 37 minutes while the clock on the microwave moved forward, to be smarter than what he was feeling. The drive to that parking lot with the bear buckled into the passenger seat. The hours in attorney's offices. The morning in the courthouse. He thought about all of it, the full arc of it, and then he let it settle. It was history now, heavy and real and entirely behind him. Daddy, yeah. Mia looked up from her arrangement. Her eyes were the serious brown they had always been, the eyes that took in more than they ever released at once. She held his gaze with the steady attention of a child who has chosen her moment carefully. You didn't let her take me. 5 words, said in the flat, clean voice of a child who has thought about something alone in the dark until it distills into its simplest form. No performance in it. No appeal. Just a thing that needed to be said and was being said now, in the morning, with Button watching from the center of the rug. Darren looked at his daughter. No, he said. Never. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she gave a small, decided nod, the nod of a person confirming something that needed confirming, and turned back to her arrangement. Her hands moved with the careful certainty that was entirely hers. Things went where they belonged. Small corrections. The precise placement of a thing set exactly right. Button sat at the center of all of it. One ear stitched twice, the thread darker than the rest. Stuffing uneven, fuller on one side. The fur faded at the edges from 5 years of being held. Darren leaned back on his hands and looked at the rusted fence through the window. It was the same fence it had always been. He had never painted it. On a list of things that had not gone the way he planned, it sat near the top. He looked at it for a moment. The rust, the brown, the particular angle of the late morning light against the old metal, and found that it had stopped meaning anything except what it was. A fence, in a yard, behind a house where a man and his daughter sat on the floor on a Saturday morning while the radio played. He looked at the drawing on the wall. Green sky, 3 stick figures, careful printed labels. He stayed on the floor. That was all. That was everything.